So what is unstable load training? Essentially, you can break it into 3 categories. The first one is OKE, or Oscillating Kinetic Energy. All that refers to is essentially you just take a weight like a kettlebell and you take a band, loop the band through the plate or kettlebell, and then you hang that onto the collar of a barbell. And again, it creates those kind of perturbations and gyrations to the barbell that you have to control and stabilize. The second version is the bottoms up kettlebell version. Essentially with that, you just take the kettlebell, you flip it upside down, and you perform like a chest press or shoulder press. Pretty unstable, so you have to use a lot of your stabilizers to lock it in. And then the third and final version of unstable loading, this deals with body weight exercises or unstable body weight exercises like a push-up. So with this, you would basically put your hands on a stability ball or on something like a suspension system like a pair of rings, and you would perform push-ups. It's not exactly the same as the hanging band technique, but the overall stimulus is pretty similar, because even though you're not using a load, your body weight is essentially the load, and then your point of contact is an unstable surface. So for all intents and purposes, pretty similar. Now, before we go any further, I want to address something that I've already talked about briefly in some of my other videos, and that's that I'm not trying to push this as something that should make up the bulk of your training. This is something that you should simply use in addition to or in conjunction with your foundational free weight exercises, your barbell, dumbbell, and cable movements. So this is not something that replaces any of those. A lot of people think that I actually invented some of these unstable load methods. I wish I did, because it's such an effective stimulus. I did probably help popularize it somewhat and written articles about it. I've done a lot of posts with it, and I've had a lot of my athletes use it in videos. But I'm not the sole person responsible for developing it or making it popular. The man who is responsible is Louie Simmons. He's the founder of Westside Barbell. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but he's really considered one of the leading pioneers. Also helped develop some of the strongest and most renowned powerlifters in the world. I think he's responsible for having more 1,000-pound squatters and 600-pound bench pressers. A lot of those records still stand today, but Louie was big on exploring different training methods, and one that he came upon was the Oscillating Kinetic Energy method, or the hanging band technique. So there's a pretty cool video that I want to just watch for a few seconds and react to that, and this will lead us into the next segment looking at some of the research. So let's see what Louie Simmons had to say about this method. So here's Louie here performing bench press with the hanging band method, and that's a pretty freaking insane amount of weight to be doing with this method. But here he's going to talk a little bit more about it. Let's see what he has to say.
Well, it's helped me rehab. It works all the stabilizers, and also with heavier weights it makes me actually stronger. But I use a bar like this. When I had a shoulder socket surgery, 3 months later I benched 300 pounds in a t-shirt. Therapist told him in 4 months he could handle 2 pounds. In 2 months he's doing 135% to 20, basically because of this bar working stabilizers of the tricep. I can never do upright rows, but with this bar I can do upright rows because of shoulder engagement. We don't really know scientifically why. I've never had a person come in and study this bar from a physiological standpoint. I have a physics professor. It's a pendulum chaotic oscillating effect is what it does for strength. What it does to the body, truly I don't know until I get someone from a high level of physiology.
Okay, so you heard it right there. He knows that it's helping his body. He knows that it's helped a lot of his athletes and powerlifters that he's trained. And at that time, I think this was about 15 years ago, possibly more, but there wasn't a whole lot of research on this topic. So he was kind of relying on the whole idea of stabilizing the unstable load, and realized that it helped his body, but he didn't quite understand the science. So now that we have more science on this topic, I want to dive deeper into it so we can see why it works. So I have 6 research studies that I want to go over, but before we do that, I want to just lay out the general design, because most of these studies were pretty similar. And basically what they did is they took an exercise like a bench press, and they had one group perform the movement in a traditional manner, like a traditional barbell bench press, and then the other condition or the other group did the same exact exercise using the oscillating kinetic energy system. And then what they did, they just looked at the results. They compared the EMG analysis and amplitude to see which was better, and we're about to find out. So let's start off with the first study here. So this first study to me is pretty groundbreaking. This one was done in 2020 by Soderbacken. I believe that's how you pronounce it. And this one, what they showed was that when they performed or compared traditional bench press versus the unstable bench press where they hung the weights from the bar, the EMG amplitude in the pectorals, in the chest, okay, it was actually greater in the group that performed the unstable load training. So this is kind of crazy because you think of, wow, unstable training, it's only good for the stabilizers and not the big muscles. Well, this study actually showed that the primary movers or the muscles we're really intending to target, the chest, the pecs, you might get more growth according to this study because you had greater muscle activation according to the EMG amplitude. In another study done in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research in 2017 by Ostrowski and his colleagues, it showed that there was more muscle activation of the stabilizers when they performed the unstable training method or the unstable bench press compared to the traditional bench press. And this was shown by the EMG activity in those smaller stabilizers, particularly a lot of the small muscles around the shoulder complex. And I know what you're thinking, that perhaps that's not your goal when you're doing a bench press, but for a lot of athletes, as well as powerlifters, those small stabilizers, those are key not just for injury prevention, but also for building a stronger, more stable bench press. Another study also in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research by Lawrence and his colleagues in 2015. This one's a bit different because they actually looked at the barbell squat, not the bench press. They looked at a lower body exercise. And they didn't find that the legs necessarily had more activation, although it doesn't appear that there was less activation, but there was more activation and more firing of the muscles around the core and the muscles that protect the spine. So again, this is something that if you're thinking about how do you program this is huge for athletes, for powerlifters, even for general fitness purposes, because if you can cue your body or reinforce into your nervous system how to fire your core more aggressively on a barbell squat, when you go back to heavier loads and traditional barbell movements, you're going to actually be able to handle heavier loads and protect your spine. And in another study also performed by Lawrence and his colleagues in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, this study was kind of unique because they actually looked at the firing patterns of the muscle, and this relates a little bit more to motor control, having stability or control of the movement, not just how high things were firing or how low the level of EMG activity was. So with this, I'm just going to actually read exactly what the researchers themselves said. Unstable condition was more challenging to control, we would expect that, but the subjects controlled the instability by contracting their muscles in a more stable pattern, or as the researchers say here in quotes, staying tight throughout the exercise. That is an absolutely pivotal finding and pivotal statement for them to say, because this is one of the most important cues that you can give an athlete or someone that's lifting with heavy weights is stay tight. Maintain full body tension, because this drives a lot of other physiological elements from overall motor unit recruitment and muscle activation, meaning you can fire up all those fast twitch fibers so you can handle more weight, proprioception so you have better sense of feel, joint stability. All those factors come back to staying tight. So pretty cool findings here. And one of the most recent studies done in 2024, this was a systematic review and meta-analysis by Batista and his colleagues. What they found with this, very fascinating, that the group that did the unstable push-ups actually had more pectoral activation and tricep activation compared to the group that did traditional push-ups. So again, if we're looking for muscle growth or overall strength gains or efficiency of firing, this basically confirms what we've known all along, is that unstable exercises can actually lead to more muscle activation and ultimately more muscle growth. And in the last study that I want to go over, also the most recent, done in 2024 by Bush and his colleagues, again, a little bit different because they looked at kettlebell exercises, particularly the bottoms up kettlebell press. And with this one, They didn't necessarily find that the larger muscles of the shoulders or the pectorals fired more. And again, we wouldn't really expect anything but that. But they did find that some of the smaller muscles around the shoulder girdle and around the shoulder joint, largely responsible for really stabilizing that joint and making sure that the joint is stacked, those muscles actually activated to a greater extent. So again, if you're looking for an exercise modality that helps you improve joint stability and joint health, pretty tough to beat, as the research shows. So we looked at a lot of the research and the science, and now I want to just kind of use some of these mechanisms that the research confirms, and I want to explain how I apply that to my training, and also things that I've noticed with my athletes, and show how it's basically confirmed by research, but also kind of anecdotal and experiential evidence that I've witnessed firsthand. So the first thing I want to talk about that I've noticed with unstable loading was that it really helps to cue a lot of the basic tips and techniques that we try to get our athletes to emulate. For example, if you do a bench press with your elbows flared, which is something you don't want to do, you want to fire your lats and really tuck those elbows, which places the shoulder into a much safer and stronger position. If you perform an unstable bench press like the hanging band technique with the elbows flared and the lats not really firing, you're going to have insane levels of instability. And I've seen this almost essentially every time I work with an athlete. I kind of throw them into this and don't give them too much cueing. And if their elbows are flared, immediately you see them almost lose control, and they're basically yelling for help. They're like, wow, I got to rack this. It's too unstable. Because as soon as they tuck the elbows, fire the lats, and really pack that shoulder joint, they notice they now have control over the movement, and all those cues that we'd given them previously leading up to this, they basically have to implement it to keep control over the barbell. Another key thing that we've seen with our athletes when they implement these unstable loads is that they have improved joint centration or joint stacking. That's just fancy terminology for saying that we balance those forces and that tension across the various involved joints so that there's not too much pressure on one particular area of the joint or any one particular joint itself. It's equally dispersed, kind of like what we would want with a bridge where we have those support structures, so the pressure and force is dispersed across. Another thing that we've noticed with our athletes when they use the unstable loading method is that they have increased levels of muscle stiffness, and we kind of already referenced this with some of the research when it talks about staying tight. Well, that's what this means, and we see this immediately with our athletes when they start doing the hanging band exercises and a lot of these unstable movements. You notice right off the bat that they get tighter, they lock things in more, they have more full body tension, and they just have overall more control over the movement, and they're stiffer. And that's critical not only for joint health and for controlling the movement, but it also helps wake up those muscle spindles. We've talked about muscle spindles. Those are the little feedback mechanisms embedded with inner muscles that give us feedback about sense of feel, and your ability to fine-tune your body mechanics actually becomes better even though you're doing something like an unstable exercise. So I want to talk briefly about how to actually apply this method to your training. As I mentioned earlier, you don't need to eliminate traditional methods or traditional movements and replace them with these. These are done in addition to. In terms of how we use them with our athletes, we use them typically once every few weeks. If they need more of it because we see that they're lacking control and stability, we might use it a bit more often, but we also use it as a way to deload the body. Some of the research actually shows, and I didn't mention this earlier, but it was kind of a smaller point. A lot of the studies, what they found is that they were able to have similar or more muscle activation using lighter loads. And that's a pretty huge point, because if you're working with athletes or if you're working with someone who's beat up, even a power lifter or weightlifter or bodybuilder, they might want to have a day here and there where they're having less stress on their body and less total load on their joints, but they still want that high level of muscle activation. So with our athletes, if we have them do a full body workout 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we might go more traditional heavy barbell on Monday and Friday, and then perhaps on a Wednesday, we might actually implement this lighter loads and more therapeutic modalities. Generally want to start off pretty light, because at the beginning of this, if you're not familiar with unstable loads, you're going to find it difficult to control the movement. So I recommend 30 to 40% of what you would use with traditional barbell movements, and then you can gradually progress upward. Now, I like to go by something I refer to as the 80% rule. So with athletes that are very efficient, their nervous systems are very locked in, they've really learned to master their movement. what I've found personally is that they can typically handle around 80% of the load they would use on traditional barbell movements and still use 80% of that on those unstable movements. So if they're doing, say, for example, 500 pounds on a barbell squat, well, they can actually handle roughly 405 on an unstable or hanging band squat, and I've actually done that myself. I rarely go past 500 pounds on a traditional barbell squat, but on something like an unstable hanging band squat, I've gone up to as much as 405. So if you can do 80% of your max weight with the unstable loading method, you know you're probably pretty locked in and you've mastered your movement. So at this point, my biggest recommendation is to simply try this. I know you've probably seen this on the internet and maybe it looks a little bit goofy, but I promise once you try it, you're going to feel some pretty unique sensations in your body and you're going to notice improvements in joint health. And as Louie Simmons said himself, this pioneer in strength and conditioning, it not only improved his joint health, but it actually improved his overall strength in movements like the bench press. And if you have any more questions on this topic of the unstable loads, as well as the hanging band method or the bottoms up method, I have some articles on my website. We'll include those links below. So check those out and definitely give this method a try.